2017 factory calibration, which has a STK file on the end of it, to just kind of familiarize ourselves with the tables that are within a tune and talk about the C3 tuning software in general. So let's go ahead and open up your Jet Power Core application launcher and select the C3 tuning software. Yours won't open that fast. I already have mine minimized. So basically, what you'll be presented the very first time you open C3 is this window here. This is the factory default. You have gauges over here that will that you can configure and set up to basically monitor your engine as you are connected to it in real time. 99.9% of us will not be connected to our bikes in real time on a dyno, so we don't want that. So I suggest you close those files, come over here to layup under the view, save that, and save it as your layout. Now I've already done that here, so I don't need to do it. So going back to home, you have your open, save, save as. And basically I don't use hardly anything else there. The view, again, this is how you restore your layout. If you have messed something up, just go ahead and restore it. Compare tab is very useful. You compare your currently open saved tune with one that you've just corrected, so you can see what has changed after the corrections were made, or you can compare it with the stock values in the tune itself. I usually use the open saved because I'm incrementally making changes through each cycle. Then we have tools under here. This is where we will see the Tune Lab module as soon as we get a tune loaded up. The only other thing is this enable cell trace. Here you will use that once you have logs loaded in if you want to get an idea where the engine is operating at any one time throughout the logs. Very useful feature, this enable cell trace. But anyway, let's go ahead and open up a 2017 stock file, which is this one. Let's go up here. You see that the tune that we just opened is here. You could open up multiple tunes, make different comparisons and all that. So you might have a whole list of tunes right here. I would suggest you limit this to 3 or 4 at the most because it gets really tough to keep up with where you're at. The tune info selection gives you this dialog. Every time you save your tune, this dialog is going to come up. Not the whole thing, but this description. You could type in information such as this is my first pass and so forth. Corrected VTable, corrected IPW table. The next is if you want to set security to your tune. If it's just you dealing with it, don't bother. If you want to give this tune out to someone, but you don't want someone monkeying with it, I would encourage you to hit this and to set your password. I would say, check that box too to remember it. And you could say always apply save password, so when you close the tune, it will automatically apply the password. Then you have your advanced tab. It's really information tab. You know your tune compatibility, you know your checksum, your VIN that this STK was read from, and so forth. Okay, you will not have the DTC folder. I'm doing some tests, so I do. You will have the monitor folder, which is basically, again, only useful if you're connected to your bike. Your PV3 is connected, your computer is connected to your PV3, and the bike is running. Then you would see values in here in real time. Very useful when you're doing some dyno tuning. Airflow, mass flow through the throttle body. This is a very important table. This is essentially an alpha end table. You have throttle position here, TPS is throttle position sensor in percentage, so from closed to wide open. Then you have engine RPM here. So this is by definition alpha N table. Very important table. If you this table is active on startup, engine starting, on warm up. I believe during some transitionary periods of the engine, and definitely if you lose your map sensor. I don't know if anybody really touches this table or tunes it properly. We're going to learn how to tune this table. I wrote an equation that will do it. Most of the time you'll just see somebody touch it here and maybe add some cells here, just add some percentages here, but we're going to learn how to tune it right. Okay, drive-by-wire. This is one of the easiest things to realize some good performance, and we'll have a detailed tutorial on that as we go. Environment, I don't know why this is still in this calibration on the TS111s and TS116s. This value has no merit. It does on the Scout, but not on these. I believe it does on FTR as well. Now under fuel, this is where a lot of our action will take place. The component tables, I really don't, the component protect tables I don't touch while I'm tuning. It's a modeled EGT, which is exhaust gas temperature. This is modeled. This is from Polaris. They put sensors on the exhaust and they modeled it under various conditions. So I don't touch that. Individual cylinders. We will be tuning these cylinders. An injector compensation factor front and rear makes very little difference on the engine's tuning. But we will learn how to tune this table after we do our main adjustments to the VE table and the IPW comp front and rear table, which I'm showing here. These are the two main tables that affect cylinder fuel balance between the cylinders. Very important. Startup, you have your warm-up AFR on your engine, so we will modify this if you're having some cold start problems. Here's a much more elaborate table that you can modify to get some more enrichment or less enrichment at certain temperatures. And here's a startup post fuel, which is number of crankshafts, revs. So it's doesn't really do much, but it's a pretty important table for startup. Usually we leave those alone. Alternate target AFR, I've seen this table change to 12.98. I usually leave it at 13.21. Delay for fuel cutoff. This is a useful table if you have a stage 2 and you're experiencing some exhaust decel popping due to a more open exhaust. This is the value I usually change. I think I put a 0.8 second delay for the fuel to shut off, and that kind of gives it a rich condition so it overcomes the lean condition that's causing the exhaust pop. All these rest of these values I'll leave alone. This is the main table we will be addressing as we move forward. Let's put it in 3D mode down there. As you can see, it's pretty fat from the factory. There's no reason to have 12.17 unless you might have some concerns that your VE table is not accurate. Then you want to ensure that you are pretty pig rich. This is the closed looped area. The 14.7 tells the ECU to use the O2 sensors and to maintain a supervised 14.7 to 1 air fuel mixture out the exhaust pipe. You might want to say, well, why don't I just put everything in closed loop? Well, that's a very bad idea, especially the value I just picked. Very bad idea, because under high loads and high RPMs, you most likely will overheat and scuff your pistons. So, storing it back, we are going to change this. I typically change it up to 70 and up to 6,000 while I'm tuning. For a particularly strong bike, I will go up to 75. Anything above that, just don't want to do. Now also remember, this table is what the ECU is being asked to provide out the tailpipe. It doesn't know what it's doing except in the closed loop areas. That's the only area that it knows for sure what it's putting out, because it's a monitored condition. Anything else is just a guess. This is why tuning is extremely important, because once you tune your VE and your IPW comp tables, then what's coming out of your tailpipe's a pretty good estimate with the value that you put in on this table here. So that's the goal. Get a very accurate tune. Fuel injection. Leave this table alone. This table is a nightmare. Leave this table alone unless you know what you're doing. If you're on a dyno and you have a special build like Jeff Tudor and I've dealt with on his strokers, this is a table we will modify, but you should not touch this table. This is a nice table to touch if you're having kind of cold weather, low voltage performance on starting. You might want to change these values here, at least from 8 to 12 volts. And we'll go through that as we go through the tutorial. Injection scaling, this is what tells the ECU basically what size your injectors are. This calibration is based on 280 cc injectors. So if I go to 350 or 450, this value is going to get smaller, 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 because it's actually wants to ask for a smaller pulse width to the injectors, which comes down to a minimum of 0.734 milliseconds is your most narrowest pulse width. Your idle table, your main idle is this first table. I like to change these values and make them a little bit higher on RPM. If you have a stage 2, a lot of them need or like to be run at 850, so you would put 0.85 in here and change that value. I typically don't touch idle speed 2. I have changed this to 800 on some calibrations. The ECU doesn't use this table a lot, so leave it stock unless you're having idle issues. This table, as you can see, is the source of a lot of issues and problems when we first started tuning our bikes. The Indian has a bad habit of having surging when you're decelerating, under load coming to a traffic light or what have you, and you keep your clutch out. It will come down and all of a sudden will jump up in RPM, and that's because this vehicle speed versus the RPM is a mismatch. And so it will jump from, say, 900 to 1100 RPM. Well, that's just ridiculous. We early on, we just started changing this table to 800, so it will not do that. And even Polaris now keeps this table at the idle speed. But if you change this to 850, be sure to change this to 850. Now at the knock control, I typically never touch these except for the max knock retard, and we'll discuss that. I think this is too much retard under most conditions, except for stock, perhaps. But I'll be telling you what I like to put in there as we move forward. This is quite complicated, and it's just best to leave it alone, except for the max knock. Miscellaneous is engine displacement. You can see for our 1800 cc engines, it's kind of off here. It's 13.249 more cc's. don't get bent out of shape on that. This is a great place to change the overall tune if you are seeing issues with your VTable maxing out or your IPW injector comp tables. You can adjust this up or down and it will adjust everything automatically for you. If you have a new build, if you're building some exotic bike like a 118, a 120, 126, so forth, you would want to set this to whatever your actual CCs are. All right, rev and speed limits. Max RPM for twist grip and brake. Just leave that at 6K. This one for max vehicle speed for twist grip plus brake is set to 124. That's a reasonable number. We, with our ratio, you aren't going to exceed 124.27. That's probably why they have that value in there. I've seen some folks go in there and put 130, and that's kind of meaningless. Bike's just not going to see that. Virtual machine having issues with that. Rev limit 1, this is where you would raise your limit, say 5,600. You don't want to go crazy here. You need to take in consideration several things. One, your rods, your pistons, and also your cam. And most of our cams that we have for these bikes have long given out by the time they hit 5K, so why raise your limiter unless you absolutely need to? Rev limit by gear, you can see how funky this thing is. I just like to set it all to the same value that my rev limiter is set to. Rev limit hysteresis is 400 RPM. I think that's way too sloppy. I like to go at least 0.2 and in some cases 0.1, 100 or 200 RPM, but that's the overshoot, undershoot that the rev limiter is operating on, and when it engages and when it disengages. Speed limit, first gear, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. I like to just set these things to 130 and be done with it. You're not going to go faster than 130. Your gear ratio, your primary ratio, your max RPM on your engine, your ratio of your belt, and then your circumference of your tire will not allow you to go 130 miles per hour. And then you got the wind resistance and load of the actual road. So maybe on a dyno you might get it. Well, you're still limited by your ratios. On the real world, you're never going to get it. Not without having a whole lot more horsepower than our bikes can put out. Okay, moving down, sensors, map sensors under there. We don't want to touch any of this. We are going to touch this one when we go to fail the map sensor so we could tune the airflow table. But leave those alone. Spark, your coil dwell is a interesting table. You could burn your coil up if you increase this, go crazy with this value. There's a discussion that we'll have on the forum about possible performance improvements by adding a little bit more dwell time to some of these values. I've had one person say that it was very beneficial. I never really messed with it on my bike. I was happy with the performance it had, but we could visit this. Ignition timing, 1 primary. This is your main ignition table. Now Polaris has made timing extremely complicated on our bikes. You have 4 timing tables, 1 through 4. 3 and 4 essentially are tables that deal with deceleration and heating and minimum allowed timing. So we aren't going to be touching those tables unless you're copying from one calibration over to another. Basically, timing 1 and timing 2 tables will dictate the behavior of the timing of your engine. Timing on primary 1 is used almost all the time. In fact, if it's not being used, one ECU engineer kind of reminded me, if it's not being used, then you need to, and if it's not in idle, then you need to find out why not. Because the only time this table is really not used is when it's at idle. And that's when it's using this table, and then you have all sorts of modifications here that come into play. And I spelled all that out on my blog. You could look at all these notes on the blog and try to make sense of this. It's very complicated. And when people complain about the transition from idle to low RPM, say 12, 13, 1400, this is this table that's doing that problem. You might get some jumpiness, some oscillations and so forth. It's all because these timing tables are flipping back and forth, and it's not a smooth transition. Very, very hard to get this smooth. If anybody figures that one out, great, let me know. I've attempted spreadsheets and everything else. I just have to do it by brute force. Timing modifier for the front cylinder, as its name implies, it could add or remove timing for certain load versus RPM from your main primary table that is being called on for your front cylinder timing. In this case, it's removing 1.5 degrees of timing when it's at this load and this RPM. The rear has this that it's removing. You could add or remove timing. Usually you want to remove timing. We typically don't use these cylinders unless we're doing some automatic equations to take out some knock sensor activity. Timing retard due to engine temperature and IAT, that's air intake temperature, intake air temperature. I typically don't touch this as well. I find it set pretty good. So if it gets really hot coming in, the engine's hot and the air coming in is hot, it's going to take some timing out, which is what you want. You're getting less dense air and you want to remove some timing. Same with this. This is a multiplier, and essentially depends on the load versus RPM. It will take, multiply it by whatever this thing is. So if, say it's right here and you are at the 0.5, then you're going to take out 1.5 degrees instead of 3 degrees. Now the tip in, tip out table, in my opinion, is a table that just kills performance. And Polaris, I think, agrees because they've set all this to 0 in later calibrations. That's kind of what I like, unless you get a lot of pinging when you hit your throttle. Speed density. This is the main table. This essentially models the true airflow through your engine. All the engine is air pump. The more air you flow, the more efficient it is, the more horsepower you put out. This is the table we'll be operating on in conjunction with the IPW comp front and rear. We'll be making single pass corrections on both those tables plus the VE table, and it makes your tune converge very quickly. But in any case, this is the VE table. It's based on load along this side. The higher the load, the more is being demanded out of the engine, and the RPM. So you will see, the idea is to see corrections in all these cells. In reality, you can't do that, not without a dyno. This is a table that compensates for air pulsations, I believe, within the intake. It's a measured value that I believe Polaris is set up to measure, so I don't touch this table. I copy it over with other calibrations if I need to make a compatible tune. Misfire monitor. This is a useful table. If you're building a tune, I usually don't touch this table except for this very last table, which is set to 5 seconds, meaning it will wait for 5 seconds before it detects misfires. Well, I think that's too short. Our bikes are happy. Misfire detector, so I usually set that for 2 minutes. These rest of the tables you could look at and you could glean some experience from other calibrations. Again, unless I am building a stage 1 or a stage 2 based on a stock, I will leave these alone. They seem to do a pretty good job. Torque limits. Our bike does not, well, it produces torque. When you are hitting that throttle, you're essentially saying, hey, I want to apply more torque to the wheels. So these are our limit cells. Basically on most of these calibrations we will not touch these tables. On 2019 above we will, because it has a slew of extra tables that we will want to at least get them to 100. I usually put 150 in there and take it out of the equation. Okay, that is the tune calibration overview of a 2017 bike.